My daughter-in-law called me on a Tuesday afternoon, which was unusual. She never called me. She texted sometimes when my son wasn't available and she needed something passed along. But she called that Tuesday, and when I picked up, she was already talking. "We're having dinner Friday with the Whitfields," she said. "Preston's firm just landed their account, and this is the introductory dinner. Very important people. Old money. I need you to come because Preston wants his father there. But I need you to understand something beforehand." I said, "All right. Don't volunteer information about yourself. If they ask what you did, just say you were in facilities management. That's close enough to the truth. And please, no stories about the Navy. These people are from a different world, and I need this dinner to go smoothly." I said, "I understand, Melissa." She exhaled, relieved. "Thank you. And wear the blazer Preston bought you for Christmas. Not the brown one you like." I wore the brown one. I'm 63 years old, and I've earned the right to wear whatever jacket I please. My son Preston is 41. He married Melissa 11 years ago in a ceremony at a vineyard outside of Charlottesville. It cost more than my first house. She comes from a family in Richmond's West Side, the kind that has a hyphenated last name on their mailbox, and a grandmother with a wing named after her at the Children's Hospital. Melissa is not unkind. I want to be fair about that. She is efficient, organized, and she loves my son in her own way. But she has always been quietly embarrassed by me, in the way that people are embarrassed by something they can't quite explain away. I was a custodian. That's what she could never fully resolve. Not facilities management, not environmental services, not whatever polite term the hospital system used after 2005. I pushed a mop. I emptied wastebaskets. I buffed floors at 2 in the morning when the hallways were empty and the only sounds were the ventilation system and my own footsteps. I did it for 31 years at St. Catherine's Medical Center in Richmond, Virginia, and I was good at it, and I was proud of it, and that has never changed. What Melissa didn't know, or Preston only partially understood, was that somewhere around year 8 of my time at St. Catherine's, I started buying stock. My mother grew up during the Depression. She had a particular relationship with money, not fear exactly, more like respect. She kept cash in 3 different places in the house, not because she didn't trust banks, but because she believed in redundancy. She used to say, "A dollar you can see is a dollar you can count." When she passed in 1994, she left me a small amount, $42,000. My wife Gloria, God rest her, wanted to remodel the kitchen. I understood why. Our kitchen was genuinely terrible, but I kept thinking about my mother's hands, the way she folded bills into an envelope and labeled it in pencil, and I couldn't spend that money on cabinets. I put it in the market instead. Not cleverly, not with any particular genius. I put it in index funds and I forgot about it mostly. Then I put in a little more when I could. $100 here, $250 there. When the hospital offered a fall 3B match, I maxed my contribution every year, which my coworker Hank thought was excessive, and I thought was the minimum a person ought to do. I drove a 2003 Silverado for 14 years. I did not take vacations that required flights. I bought my dress shoes at Dillard's on clearance, and I wore them until the soles separated. Gloria passed in 2019. Pancreatic cancer 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end. She was the only person who knew the full shape of things, and she took that knowledge with her, which I sometimes think was her small joke at my expense. She had a dry sense of humor, my wife. After she was gone, the financial picture had grown to something I won't fully detail here, except to say it was substantial. I still went to St. Catherine's. I retired at 61, only because my knees made the night shifts unbearable, not because I needed to. I still drove a Silverado until last spring when the transmission finally gave out and I bought a used F-150 in a color Melissa once described as unfortunate. Preston knows I'm comfortable. He knows I helped him buy his first car, helped with his graduate school tuition, wrote a check for the vineyard wedding without blinking. He has chosen, I think, not to examine the arithmetic too closely. There's a particular way children decide not to look at things about their parents, and Preston has that quality where my finances are concerned. Melissa's never asked. The dinner was at a place called Alderman's in the Fan District, the kind of restaurant that doesn't list prices online and makes you feel underdressed even if you're not. The Whitfields were arriving separately, and we got there first. Melissa straightened Preston's lapel in the parking lot. She looked at my brown blazer once, briefly, the way you look at a forecast you'd already prepared for. The host walked us to a large round table in a private dining room. I noticed Melissa steer the seating so that I ended up with my back partially to the door, wedged between Preston's junior associate and an empty chair. Not the worst seat, just the least visible one. The Whitfields arrived 7 minutes later. There were four of them: the patriarch, his wife, their son who worked with Preston's firm, and a man who came in last and was introduced simply as Margaret's father, Dr. Hale. Margaret was the son's fiancée, I gathered. Dr. Hale. Hale was a compact man in his mid-70s, white-haired, wearing a dark suit that had been made for him by someone who knew what they were doing. He had the walk of a person who has been in charge of rooms for a very long time. He was about halfway through shaking hands around the table when he reached me. He stopped. Not a polite stop. A full stop, the kind where the next motion doesn't come for a moment. He looked at me and I looked at him and he said, "Well, I didn't expect to see you here, Kenneth." The table got very quiet. His name was Dr. August Hale. I had not seen him since 2017. He was, for nearly 2 decades, the chief of surgery at St. Catherine's, and before that at 2 other hospital systems, and before that he had been an army surgeon in a different century. He was also, for a period of about 4 years in the early 2000s, the person who asked me every Friday morning whether I'd caught the game, because we were both in early in the hallway. Outside OR3 was where I started my rounds and where he ended his. He remembered things about me that I had said in passing on those Friday mornings. He knew my wife's name. He knew Preston had gone to law school. He knew about the index funds because I had mentioned it once, casually, the way you mention things to someone you see often enough that conversation gets honest. "Gus," I said, "it's been a while." He sat down next to me, which had not been the seating arrangement, and he waved the young man who was supposed to be there toward another seat, with the unconcerned authority of someone who has rerouted much larger things. "How long has it been?" he asked. "About 6 years. I retired in 21. "You look well." He turned to the table where the conversation had not entirely resumed. Melissa was watching us with an expression I couldn't fully read. "Kenneth and I go back a long way," Dr. Hale said pleasantly to no one in particular. "He kept St. Catherine's running for 30 years. There are surgeons over there who don't know that half of what they could accomplish in those ORs was because the floors were clean and the systems worked." He looked back at me. "I used to tell people you were the most quietly capable man in that building." Melissa said, "That's so kind," and her voice was careful. "Dr. Hale has never been a man who mistakes kindness for accuracy." He said, "It's not kindness. I watched him manage more than I think most people knew he was managing. He asked me about St. Kindness, Catherine's endowment fund, which is something I have been involved with in an advisory capacity for a few years before I retired, at the board's invitation. I told him it had grown well." He nodded, satisfied. Under the table, I could feel Melissa's attention, even though she was 4 seats away. The dinner moved on. Conversation spread back out. The food was good. The Whitfields were pleasant people, genuinely, and their son had a handshake like he meant it. Melissa recovered herself and was gracious and warm and very good at her job, which is being impressive in rooms. But at one point during the entrees, she leaned slightly toward Preston and said something under her breath. "I have good hearing, better than I let on usually." She said, "Why didn't you tell me your father knew Dr. Hale?" Preston said quietly, "I didn't know he knew him," which was true. I had never mentioned it. I had never mentioned a lot of things. After dinner in the parking lot, Dr. Hale found me before I reached my truck. His wife had gone ahead with the others. "You still in the same house?" he asked. "Same house." "Gloria's roses?" "Still coming up every spring." I paused. "She'd have liked this restaurant." "She would have found it pretentious," he said, "and then eaten everything on the table." He was right. I smiled for the first time that evening in a way that felt like mine. He said, "Come have coffee sometime. I want to hear about what you've been doing since you retired." "I've mostly been doing nothing." "Kenneth," he said my name the way people do when they mean don't insult me. "You have never done nothing in your life." We shook hands and he walked back toward his daughter's family, and I stood there in the evening air next to my used F-150 in the unfortunate color, and I thought about what he'd said. I drove home. I sat in the kitchen, our kitchen, still with Gloria's curtains, the ones she picked out because they had a pattern of small blue birds that she said were ridiculous but cheerful, and I thought about the dinner. Preston called around 10. Dad. I'm up, I said. He was quiet for a moment. You knew Dr. August Hale. From the hospital. We talked on Friday mornings for about 4 years. He's on 3 hospital boards. He was the keynote at the Johns Hopkins Leadership Symposium last year. Dad, he talked about you like. Preston stopped. I didn't know. You didn't ask. That sat there between us. Preston is a good son. He has my mother's stubbornness and Gloria's way of going silent when he's actually thinking, which I've always taken as a compliment. He said, Melissa was embarrassed tonight. I want you to know I wasn't embarrassed. I want you to know I wasn't embarrassed. I want to be clear about that. I know you aren't. But I also didn't know, and I should have known. I should have asked more. I didn't have a simple answer to that, so I didn't offer one. We talked for a while longer. He asked about the hospital endowment, and I told him what I could without making it strange, which is a balance I've been navigating for a long time. When we hung up, I sat with the lights low in the kitchen, and I thought about what I actually wanted to say to him, which is different from what I said. What I wanted to say was this. I never hid who I was. I drove the truck I drove because I liked it and it was paid for. I wore the brown blazer because it's comfortable and it belonged to me. I pushed a mop for 31 years because the work was honest and because hospitals require exactly that kind of honesty. Floors that don't harbor infection, systems that don't fail, routines that hold even at 2 in the morning when no one is watching. I put money aside because my mother showed me how to respect the dollar, and because Gloria and I agreed early that we wanted choices in old age, and because the market rewards patience if you can manage not to blink. None of that was hidden. It was just quiet. But there's something I've had to sit with, something Dr. Hale said at the table that I keep turning over. He said I was the most quietly capable man in that building, and he meant it as a compliment, and I took it as one. But quietly capable is only a virtue if the quiet is intentional. If it's just fear wearing a practical face, that's different. And I have asked myself more than once since Gloria died whether I kept things quiet because I was private by nature or because some part of me wanted to test people, wanted to see whether they would treat me well when they thought I had nothing. Most didn't. Melissa didn't. But that's an unfair test. People can't pass a test they don't know they're taking. And I've done my wife's memory a disservice if I pretend I didn't know exactly what I was doing, at least partially. I called Preston back the next morning, and I told him I thought we should have lunch, just the 2 of us, and I would answer questions he probably had for a while. He said yes immediately, which told me the questions had been there, waiting for permission. We had lunch at a diner in Carytown because Preston grew up eating the patty melts and some things he returned to regardless of how the rest of your life has shifted. I told him the shape of things. Not every number, some privacy a man is allowed to keep, but enough. Enough that he set down his fork halfway through and looked at me with the same expression he'd had at 8 years old when I explained how compound interest worked, which is slightly stunned and then immediately practical. He said, Dad, does Melissa know any of this? She never asked. He was quiet for a moment. That's not entirely her fault. No, I agreed. It's not. We talked about his mother. We talked about my mother. We talked about the difference between privacy and silence, which is something I'm not sure I fully understood until I said it out loud to my son over a patty melt in the diner, where the ceiling fans have worked the same way since 1987. Melissa called me that Saturday. She asked if she could come by on Sunday, just her without Preston. She arrived with a pie from a bakery. Not the gesture itself, but the specific one. The same lemon chess pie she'd brought to Gloria's repast, which told me she had been thinking about how to do this correctly. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and she said, I need to say something and I'd like to say all of it before you respond. I said, go ahead. I have treated you as a problem to be managed instead of a person to be known. I did it because I thought I understood what you were, and I was wrong about that. But I also want to be honest. I'm not sure I would have treated you better even if I had known about the money. And that's actually the worst part of this. I should have treated you better regardless. Preston loves you. You raised him alone after Gloria got sick that first time, and you never made him feel the strain of it. I can see what you built in him, and I've been dismissing the person who built it. She stopped. I'm sorry. I appreciated the pie. I appreciated the honesty more. I told her I hadn't been entirely fair either, that keeping myself invisible has consequences for other people, not just for me, and that at my age I was still learning the difference between discretion and withdrawal. She nodded like she had expected me to say something complicated and was relieved when I did. We had coffee and she told me about a problem she was having with a client at her firm, and I gave her my honest opinion, and she laughed once and said, "You know, Preston said you were perceptive. I thought he was just being a son about his father." I said, "He was being a son about his father. It's still true." She laughed again. I poured more coffee. I don't know what the future of my relationship with my daughter-in-law looks like. People change slowly, usually, and sometimes they don't change at all, and they just become more honest about who they are, which is its own kind of progress. What I know is that Daenerys Alderman shook something loose in my family that had been wedged in place for 11 years, and it wasn't Dr. Hale's words that did it exactly. It was the fact that someone else's perception of me arrived in a room where my own family had never fully looked. My son knows me better now. That's worth something. Gloria would have said it was worth everything. She'd have also said I should have taken Preston to that diner years ago and told him everything over a patty melt before he married someone who needed to learn it from a surgeon in a private dining room. She was right. She usually was. The roses in the backyard came up again this spring, a little ragged in one corner where the root system has been fighting with the fence for 20 years, but still coming. Still the same color she chose. I don't know what that is exactly. Red, but deeper than red, a color she had a name for that I've forgotten. I should have asked. And that's the thing about quiet, about keeping yourself in the background and letting life move around you. Sometimes you think you're being humble, and you're actually just being absent. There's a difference, and it took me 63 years, and at dinner I almost didn't attend to see it clearly. I'm trying now to be present. It's a harder practice than it sounds. I've been thinking about the roses again. The ones Gloria planted along the back fence, the ones that keep coming up every spring, whether I tend them properly or not. There's something in that. Not magic, not fate, just consequence. She put good rootstock in good soil and did the work for years. And now the work answers for itself even when she's no longer here to see it. That's how I understand what happened at Alderman's that Friday night. Melissa didn't walk into that dinner room meaning to be unkind. She walked in meaning to manage outcomes, which is what she does, and she had already decided what I was and where I fit, and she arranged the seating accordingly. I don't blame her entirely. I'd given her very little to work with. 31 years of quiet, of driving old trucks and wearing comfortable jackets and not correcting anyone's assumptions. That's a long time to be invisible by choice. Choices accumulate. They become the shape of a life, and other people read that shape and draw their own conclusions, and if you never correct them, the conclusions harden into fact. What I've had to be honest with myself about is this: quiet isn't the same thing as humble. I told Preston that, and I meant it, but I also needed to hear myself say it. Humility is knowing your place in the order of things and being at peace with it. What I was doing at least part of the time was watching from a distance to see who would treat me well when they thought I had nothing. That's not peace. That's a long, slow audit of the people in my life, and most of them didn't know they were being evaluated. That's not entirely fair, Dr. Hale used to say, back in those Friday morning hallway conversations outside OR3, that the most dangerous gap in any hospital wasn't between departments. It was between what people assumed and what was actually true. He meant it about infection protocols and handoff procedures, but it applies here too. Melissa assumed. I allowed the assumption, and for 11 years a gap lived in the middle of my family. Preston has his mother's honesty when he decides to use it. After the dinner, after the diner, after all of it. He sat with what he'd learned, and he didn't flinch from the parts that implicated him too. That takes something. It takes the willingness to look at a situation and say, I had a role in this, even when the easier story is to be the wrong party. I was proud of him for that, though I didn't say it in those words. I probably should have. And Melissa came on Sunday with lemon chest pie and said her piece, without softening it into something easier to say. That also takes something. It takes the discipline to sit with your own discomfort long enough to convert it into an honest sentence, and then to say the sentence out loud to the person you'd rather not be having that conversation with. What I know, at 63, is that the choices we make about how to carry ourselves, how much to share, how much to protect, how much to ask of the people we love, those choices don't stay private. They move through everything. They shake the marriages our children build, the assumptions that grow up around dinner tables, the years that pass in comfortable silence that isn't entirely comfortable. Gloria knew who I was. She asked. She kept asking in the way that good people do, not to catch you out, but because they're genuinely curious about the person they chose. I should have taught Preston to ask the same way. That's on me. That's the thing I'm still working on, even now, even with the roses coming up and the kitchen curtain still blue and the seat across the table empty. I'm trying to be less quiet about the things that matter. It's harder than it sounds, and it is also, I think, the only work left worth doing.